Welcome to The Debate. Imagine a massive industrial pressure cooker without any functional release valve.
Sounds incredibly dangerous.
It is. You have raw, combustible ingredients inside. The heat is cranked up to the absolute maximum, and the structural integrity of the vessel is just being tested in real time. That is the mechanical reality of the high-stakes financial and political collision course unfolding right now in Washington.
Yeah, it really is a pressure cooker.
Right. We are looking at the GOP's incredibly ambitious budget reconciliation strategy today. Specifically, we're focusing on the massive extension of the Trump tax cut package and, well, the looming multi-front budget battles required to actually pay for it.
Which are going to be massive.
Absolutely. Now, I represent the position that this reconciliation strategy, utilizing the Senate's leverage to force a unified package of pro-growth tax extensions and structural spending reductions, is not just viable, but it's actually a cohesive and historically proven way to govern when margins are tight.
And I take the contrasting view. This legislative gambit is fundamentally unstable. It is crippled by irreconcilable intra-party divisions over a price tag that sits somewhere between $3.7 and $4.2 trillion.
It's a big number.
It's huge. And the spending cuts required to offset that number are politically toxic enough to just shatter the coalition entirely.
Well, before we break down the exact mechanics of how this pressure cooker operates, we ask that you please take a quick moment to like and subscribe to the show so you never miss our deep dives.
Yes, please do.
Also, a brief housekeeping note on the Martin Stevens versus OpenAI matter. We want to explicitly clarify that this is not a lawsuit.
Right, a lot of confusion about that out there.
Yeah, exactly. The parties are currently in a voluntary quiet period, and Martin is completely safe. Just wanted to get that out of the way. So let's get straight to the floor.
Let's do it.
The fundamental unifying priority for the Republican Party right now is the extension of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, or the TCJA. We are basically talking about the core architecture of the American economic engine here.
Which expires soon.
Right. And I want to be really specific about what is at stake. This isn't just about abstract tax brackets. We are looking at the 1999A pass-through deduction. For listeners who don't run small businesses, 1990A allows owners of pass-through entities.
Like your local HVAC company.
Yeah, or a regional law firm, or a family-owned manufacturer. It lets them deduct 20% of their qualified business income before it's taxed at their personal rate. If that expires, small businesses across the country take an immediate, devastating haircut on their operating capital.
Well, look, the economic value of 199A is universally understood. Nobody is debating that. But the cost of it is being actively ignored here.
Allow me to finish setting the table, though, because we also have to factor in upfront domestic research and development expensing and 100% bonus depreciation.
Right.
Bonus depreciation is huge. It allows a company that buys, say, a $2 million piece of factory equipment to write off the entire cost in year one rather than slowly deducting it over a decade. It fundamentally changes a company's cash flow. It incentivizes immediate physical investment right here in the United States.
Sure, but letting those provisions expire, while painful, is part of the original design of the law.
But letting them expire constitutes a massive automatic tax hike on the productive economy. And because the House majority is incredibly thin right now, Senate Majority Leader John Thune is employing a strategy that basically looks like a corporate restructuring.
A hostile one, maybe.
Well, sometimes the executive board has to force a comprehensive, difficult package on a divided subsidiary to prevent total paralysis. By bypassing a formal, messy conference committee and essentially jamming the House with a Senate-crafted bill, the Senate can force the necessary tough votes.
They're hoping to deliver on these mandates by the July 4th target.
Exactly. It's practical.
That corporate restructuring analogy, it sounds clean in a boardroom, but it totally ignores the fundamental architecture of the House of Representatives.
How so?
In a corporate merger, the executive board doesn't get fired if 3 regional managers vote against the restructuring. But in the House, with a 1 or 2 vote margin, any 3 members possess the ultimate veto power over your survival. You cannot, quote-unquote, jam people who hold the keys to the building.
Well, they're going to try.
And this brings us to the raw math, which is unavoidable. The Joint Committee on Taxation estimates that extending these tax cuts will add approximately $3.72 to $4.2 trillion to the national debt over the next decade.
Over 10 years, yes.
That number, $4 trillion, is the wedge that shatters the GOP coalition.
I'd argue it's a wedge only if they fail to offset it.
But look at the two sides of that vice. On one side, you have fiscal conservatives, specifically the Freedom Caucus, demanding up to $2.5 trillion in immediate, scorable spending cuts to offset those tax extensions. They absolutely refuse to add to the debt.
Which is a standard conservative position.
Right. But on the other side, you have moderates representing swing districts who will outright reject the proposed mechanisms for those cuts, specifically the deep structural slashes to Medicaid and SNAP, the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program.
They're tough votes.
They are impossible votes for them. You have an immovable object and an unstoppable force. The Senate is attempting to force a prepackaged multi-trillion-dollar bill down the throat of a House that literally does not have the votes to swallow it.
I think you are assuming that House factions won't compromise when their backs are truly against the wall. The Senate isn't just handing down a blind mandate. They are engineering a carefully balanced package that includes pressure release valves.
Release valves like what?
Let's look at the Medicaid provider tax freeze. We know this has caused major heartburn among moderates.
Heartburn is a massive understatement. It's causing an open revolt. We should probably clarify what that provider tax actually is, because it highlights exactly why this entire strategy is so fragile.
Go ahead.
Right now, many states use a fiscal loophole. They levy a tax on hospitals and healthcare providers. The state then uses that tax revenue to claim matching federal Medicaid funds.
Yeah?
And once the federal money comes in, the state returns the original tax money back to the hospitals, plus a little extra from the federal match, and the state keeps the rest to pad its own budget. It is basically a fiscal carousel.
Which is precisely why it's a scam on the federal taxpayer. It artificially inflates federal Medicaid spending without actually improving patient care. That's exactly why the Senate wants to freeze it, to save hundreds of billions of dollars.
I agree it's a gimmick, but here's the on-the-ground reality. Rural hospitals heavily rely on that specific federal drain just to keep their doors open and the lights on.
Sure.
If you freeze that provider tax loophole overnight, you aren't just saving federal dollars, you are plunging rural healthcare networks into immediate insolvency. That is exactly why House GOP leaders are privately admitting the Senate's provider tax language just cannot pass their chamber.
Which is precisely why Senate leadership is actively adding sweeteners. They are drafting a rural hospital stabilization fund into the bill to directly appropriate money to those vulnerable facilities.
Instead of using the loophole.
Right, bypassing the state-level carousel entirely. They are directly addressing the political pressures you're highlighting. It's a calculated risk to force unity.
But House members are already on the record saying the stabilization fund won't alleviate their concerns. A temporary slush fund just doesn't offset the permanent structural damage of the provider tax freeze.
It's a starting point for negotiation.
And this isn't just a House problem either. You have senators inside the GOP conference actively warning Thune that this top-down approach is doomed. Senator Bill Cassidy explicitly stood up in a conference meeting and said the House won't be able to pass this.
People say a lot of things in conference meetings.
Senator Josh Hawley warned that simply hoping the House takes the bill without collaborative negotiation is a complete fantasy.
Look, we hear these warnings every single time a major reconciliation bill is drafted. The public complaining is just part of the negotiation process. Everyone stakes out a maximalist position early on. But let's look at a concrete example of how this negotiation is actually working constructively.
Okay.
The SALT deduction standoff. The state and local tax deduction cap is the perfect illustration of why the Senate needs to play hardball to reach a viable compromise.
The SALT cap is exactly where the math completely falls apart for coastal Republicans.
Let me explain the Senate's offer, because I think it is entirely reasonable. Under the 2017 tax law, the amount you could deduct from your federal taxes for the state and local taxes you paid was capped at $40,000.
Right.
For most of the country, that is a total not issue. But for high-income earners in high-tax states like New York and California, it was a massive hit. Now, Senator Markwayne Mullin is leading talks offering a compromise.
Which is?
He is proposing we keep the House's $40,000 cap, But we put harsher limits on how many high-income households can claim the full deduction. Specifically, lowering the income eligibility threshold to $300,000 instead of $500,000.
Okay, but
This is targeted, sensible policy. It protects middle-class families in those blue states who really need the deduction while preventing a massive revenue drain from the wealthiest coastal taxpayers.
Targeted and sensible are very subjective terms when you are the one taking the political hit. You have to consider the sheer leverage held by the House Salt Caucus. Representative Nick LaLota and his fellow blue state Republicans have made it abundantly clear they are not taking Mullen's deal.
Well, they're negotiating.
No, lowering the income threshold hurts their specific constituents. They are demanding a concession in the opposite direction, like raising the $40,000 cap to account for inflation since 2017.
They want more money.
To those specific members, whose voters are highly sensitive to property and state income taxes, the Senate's quote-unquote reasonable compromise is a complete non-starter. Alienating Nick LaLota and a handful of New York and California members threatens to torpedo the entire agenda.
But the reason Thune is pushing this dare is precisely because no Republican, not even the Salt Caucus, wants to go back to their district and say, I killed the extension of the largest tax cut in American history, and now your small business taxes are going up, all because I wanted a slightly better deal for households making $400,000 a year.
It's risky.
It is a high-stakes game of political chicken, but history consistently shows that when the final deadline arrives, the party unites around core pro-growth tax policies because the alternative is electoral disaster.
You are assuming they can successfully separate the tax cuts from how they are paid for. But in reconciliation, the cuts and the offsets are mathematically chained together, which brings us back to the structural math of those offsets.
Okay.
we touched on Medicaid, but the proposed cuts across the board are not just abstract ledger adjustments. They are profound, systemic changes to balance a $4 trillion package. They are looking at tightening Medicaid eligibility to save $715 billion and increasing SNAP work requirements to save roughly $230 billion.
Those are necessary reforms. The national debt is a profound economic threat, and you cannot demand $4 trillion in pro-growth tax extensions without finding revenue elsewhere.
Let's look at the human and political cost of finding that revenue, though. The Congressional Budget Office estimates the proposed Medicaid changes would kick 7.7 million people off the program.
It's a reevaluation of eligibility.
Whatever you call it, that is politically radioactive for moderate Republicans. We saw Senator Tom Tillis handing out flyers in the closed-door GOP conference, showing that his home state of North Carolina alone would lose $38.9 billion in Medicaid funding over a decade.
He's advocating for his state.
That puts 600,000 North Carolinians at risk of losing coverage. Tillis is up for re-election in a highly competitive purple state in 2026. How do you force members to walk a plank on $715 billion in Medicaid cuts when the math directly threatens their political survival?
I fully acknowledge the difficulty of those cuts. Leadership knows that reforming Medicaid or SNAP is incredibly fraught. But I challenge the idea that this makes the legislation impossible.
How is it possible?
The House Budget Committee has already circulated a 50-page memo outlining $3.7 trillion in potential revenue-raising options. It is not just about Medicaid. They have a robust menu to choose from.
Like what?
For example, they are looking at rolling back the massive, market-distorting subsidies for green energy programs passed under the previous administration. They are exploring the implementation of new, significant taxes on multi-billion-dollar university endowments.
A menu's useless if the guests are allergic to the food. Let's examine those alternatives. Rolling back green energy programs sounds like an easy Republican win until you map out where those facilities are actually located.
Well,
The vast majority of those new battery plants, solar manufacturing facilities, and EV supply chains are being built in Republican districts. You are asking members to vote against billions of dollars of direct investment and job creation right in their own backyards.
They opposed the bills originally.
And taxing university endowments? It polls well, sure, but it brings in a tiny fraction of what is actually needed. It is a drop in a $4 trillion bucket.
It is part of a cumulative strategy.
But the bulk of the $3.7 trillion still has to come from mandatory spending, which inescapably means healthcare and safety nets.
And here is the deeper ideological problem the party faces. The GOP coalition has fundamentally shifted.
How so?
This is no longer the country club, purely fiscal conservative party of 2005. The base is increasingly working class and populist. Many of those working class voters rely on or are adjacent to these exact safety nets.
Okay, but
When moderates tell leadership they will not vote for per capita Medicaid block grants because it hurts their base, that $3.7 trillion menu suddenly shrinks to a fraction of its size. You are asking a populist party to slash the safety net of its own voters to fund corporate tax write-offs. That is an ideological contradiction that math simply cannot solve.
I really disagree with the premise that the working class base doesn't benefit from these tax cuts. The manufacturing jobs you're talking about are sustained directly by the 1990A deduction and bonus depreciation. Capital investment creates the wages.
But the direct cuts to their health care.
More importantly, your argument assumes static political conditions. You are looking at the board as it exists today, completely in a vacuum. Congress rarely operates in a vacuum. It operates dynamically, almost exclusively under the extreme pressure of impending deadlines.
True.
The impossible math you are describing is exactly why we are seeing a massive legislative pileup right now. These looming fiscal deadlines are not bugs in the system, they are necessary forcing mechanisms.
See, I think the pileup is exactly what turns this from a difficult negotiation into a catastrophic failure.
Hear me out on the mechanics of this. Because the math doesn't work in a vacuum, you have to change the atmospheric pressure. We are looking at a scenario where Speaker Mike Johnson proposes tying the $41.1 trillion debt limit to the reconciliation bill.
Which is incredibly dangerous.
The debt ceiling is the ultimate leverage point. By pairing the debt ceiling hike with tangible structural spending cuts and historic tax reform, you successfully corral the conservative votes.
I don't see how. The Freedom Caucus won't ever vote for a clean debt ceiling increase. They consider that a total betrayal of their core principles. But they will vote for one that fundamentally rewrites the tax code, shrinks the administrative state, and cuts mandatory spending. The timeline forces the consensus.
Using the debt ceiling as a forcing mechanism in a calendar this compressed is reckless. Let's look at the calendar the source material lays out. The House only has 10 legislative weeks before the August recess.
It's tight. In that impossibly tight window, leadership is trying to squeeze a $4.2 trillion tax package, $90 billion in border security funding, $125 billion in defense funding, and a $4 trillion debt ceiling hike all into one single legislative vehicle. It is entirely too much weight for one bridge to hold.
But that is exactly why it has to be one bill, or at most two. The Senate wants to bifurcate it, do energy and border security first, then tackle the tax package. But either way, reconciliation is the only vehicle available because it circumvents the Senate filibuster. It only requires 51 votes.
Right.
The pileup is a feature, not a failure. It raises the stakes so high that failure becomes inconceivable. You force everyone into the same boat and you just point it straight at the rapids.
Failure is never inconceivable in Washington, especially when the stakes include a sovereign debt default. We have Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent explicitly warning of a mid-July default risk.
A default won't happen.
Injecting the debt ceiling into a fight over $715 billion in Medicaid cuts isn't a forcing mechanism, it's a hostage situation, where the global economy is the hostage. And the bond markets do not wait for the actual default to panic.
The markets understand the posturing.
If you blend the incredibly toxic, hyper-local politics of Medicaid provider tax cuts and blue state salt tap fights with the existential threat of a U.S. sovereign default, you risk roiling global financial markets and spiking borrowing costs before the bill is even drafted. Even the perceived threat of the default during a standoff this complex drops demand for treasuries and increases interest rates, which ironically adds billions to the very deficit you are trying to cut.
Well, the global economy is already hostage to a national debt that is rapidly approaching $41 trillion. Addressing the structural drivers of that debt, like out-of-control mandatory spending, while securing the business provisions that actually fuel our GDP, is the only real way to secure the long-term health of the markets.
At a massive near-term risk.
Yes, the mid-July timeline is a pressure cooker. Passing this through reconciliation is going to be incredibly messy.
There will be public complaining, there'll be flyers handed out in closed-door meetings, and there will be fraught late-night negotiations over income thresholds. But the gravity of the TCJA expiration is absolute. It will pull all these disparate orbits into alignment because the alternative is a massive economy-wide tax hike that no Republican can survive politically.
Gravity only works if the object has enough mass, and right now the House leadership barely has a majority. You are underestimating the sheer physics of the resistance at the local level.
I think they know what they're up against.
Everyone agrees 1990A and bonus depreciation are vital for business. But to pay for them, you are asking a Republican senator in a purple state to defend kicking constituents off their health coverage. You are asking a New York Republican to raise taxes on their voters by keeping the SALT cap strict. When the margin for error is 1 or 2 votes, you just don't have the luxury of assuming gravity will save you. A single defection over a local hospital closure caused by a provider tax freeze can bring down the entire $4.2 trillion apparatus.
Leadership knows exactly what the margins are. That is why you see these tactical maneuvers happening right now in the press and in committee. It's why the House Budget Committee is floating that massive menu of options to see what causes an allergic reaction and what doesn't.
Testing the waters.
Exactly. It's why Senator Mullen is actively negotiating the exact dollar amounts on the SALT thresholds. They are mapping the minefield. By the time this hits the floor, whether it's in April, as Speaker Johnson hopes, or it slips into May or June, the exact combination of sweeteners, like the rural hospital fund, and revenue raisers will be mathematically calibrated to hit exactly 218 votes in the House and 51 in the Senate.
That relies entirely on the premise that perfect calibration is mathematically possible. If the Freedom Caucus holds a hard line at $2.5 trillion in real, scorable spending cuts, and the moderates hold a hard line at 0 cuts to Medicaid and SNAP, there is no mathematical intersection.
We'll see.
No amount of taxing university endowments or tweaking green energy subsidies bridges a multi-trillion-dollar chasm. At some point, the raw math overrides the political willpower.
I guess we'll see who blinks first. To summarize my position, despite the visibly fractured process and the intense intra-party squabbling we're seeing, the unifying power of historic tax cuts and the intense pressure of impending fiscal deadlines will ultimately force a cohesive resolution.
That's your bet?
Yes. The GOP will successfully use reconciliation to extend the TCJA and implement necessary structural reforms. Because the alternative, letting taxes spike across the board while defaulting on the debt, is simply an outcome no faction is willing to trigger.
And to summarize my position, the deep ideological fractures over a massive $4 trillion deficit hole, combined with the politically toxic nature of the spending offsets required to fill it, make this legislative strategy structurally unworkable. By tying pro-growth tax reform to the debt ceiling and massive Medicaid cuts, they are risking a spectacular legislative failure that could trigger severe economic instability.
Well, while we clearly diverge on whether this strategy will succeed or collapse, I think we both agree on a profound point of convergence.
Which is?
The impending deadlines for the debt ceiling and government funding are going to force a massive, unavoidable political reckoning very, very soon.
Absolutely. And the sheer complexity of this package means the consequences of these negotiations will fundamentally reshape the United States economic landscape and, frankly, the ideological makeup of the GOP for the next decade.
For our listeners, we highly suggest looking directly into the source material we utilize today. It holds even more intricate details on these specific tax code mechanics, like the global intangible low-taxed income rate and the alternative minimum tax, that we only really had time to brush against today.
Yeah, if you want to understand how corporate capital flows across borders, it is absolutely essential reading. The granular mechanics of the tax code are where the real policy is made, and it's well worth your time to dive into it.
Please remember to subscribe to the show so you are always notified when we tackle these incredibly dense, high-stakes topics. We don't declare winners here. We lay out the blueprints, explain the mechanics, and leave it to you, the listener, to form your own conclusion.
Let us know what you think.
As we close, think back to that industrial pressure cooker. The heat is rising, the materials inside are volatile, and the mid-July deadline is the point where the vessel either successfully forges a new economic architecture or ruptures entirely. The pressure's on,